So we are going to move on to Virgil's Aeneid today and transition from the Greek world to the Roman world. And I wanted to talk a little bit of about the relation between the two eras and also the two central texts, or the two authors at any rate, Homer and Virgil. So I will do I'll spend a bit of time doing that. But I wanted to say just a little bit by way of transition. I left it off last class by talking about and saying that this was a central preoccupation of the tragedy. The question of human nature, I said, was central to that, because the riddle of the Sphinx to that character Oedipus related to, the riddle of what a man was. Remember, 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, 3 in the evening. And it was also at the entrance portal to the Delphic oracle itself that said, "Gno auton, know thyself." So those that came to consult at the Delphic oracle, the most famous oracle of the ancient world, were being asked to examine themselves. And later writers will say that an unexamined life is not worth living. And I think actually Socrates will be one of those that will state that. And others will believe so as well, which is the whole basis for the study that takes place in the university. We're going to examine life. But in examining life, we are dealing with the fundamental problem is we don't even know who and what we are, which was Oedipus's problem. And Oedipus didn't solve the problem. He couldn't solve the problem. He departed from the stage. We knew enough about Oedipus to know that he angered the gods. The gods were angry at humanity, and they were going to punish them for it. And it said something about the nature of the gods, but also about something about the nature of human nature, I suggested to you. But then even in Plato's Republic, when he exposits not just what the nature of the ideal republic is, but what a just human being is, we're still dealing with the problem of, so the reason should be leading the passions and following virtue, and that's what it means to lead a good life, but it still doesn't solve the problem of what is a human being. It's begging the question. And the Greeks can't answer that question. And it's for Christian theology to answer the question. This is going to be a fundamental shift that takes place, and it's going to take place contemporaneous with the Aeneid, which we're going to look at today. With the advent of Christianity, it's going to transform the ancient world. Both the Greco and the Roman view of the world is going to be transformed by the Christian faith, because Christianity does have an answer to the issue of human nature. What is a human being? In Genesis, it said we're made, Genesis 1:26 and 27. So God made man in his own image and likeness. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. That's what it says. It's a very terse, brief, and puzzling declaration, but nonetheless, there's a lot that can be taken from it, and I've suggested parts of it already to you. One of them is that this appellation, in the image of God, was in its context usually only applying to kings. Kings would bear the image of God. Pharaoh would bear the image of God. Nebuchadnezzar would bear the image of God. Caesar would bear the image of God. At the end of their lives, they would become one of the gods. In fact, they were already gods walking on earth and expected to be obeyed as if they were gods. And we see that as the context of the whole biblical scriptures. There's that appeal from the authorities that they are absolute rulers and God is humbling them effectively throughout it. But implicit in that is that every human being has an immeasurable value and worth and dignity that we attribute normally to kings only, but actually is true of every man, woman, and child. It doesn't matter their age, their station, their identity group. I talked a bit about that in relation to justice, but those things are just there in Genesis already. But the question of who God is actually asked in Scripture as well, in the book of Exodus, when Moses is called by God to go back into Egypt and to declare to Pharaoh that he's to let his people go. And Moses, who grew up as one of Pharaoh's sons and killed a man, and then fled and lived in the wilderness for 40 years, said, okay, I'm to go and do this, but who am I to say sent me? Who is it? In whose name am I going to do this? And God says in response to this, tell them, like, who are you? He says, I am. I am that I am. Or differently translated, I shall be what I shall be. That's how it's translated in that Exodus 3, right? Which is a very cryptic response, truthfully. It doesn't seem like a full answer, but it's a very important answer for Christian philosophy. It becomes the centerpiece of St. Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica. The nature of reality is related to being and the being of God. The being of the world around us, which Plato talked about in the Republic, and the being of God are connected. And so when God says that he is, in other words, he's the author of being, and he is being, he is ultimate being, not perishable being like we are, there's part of that answer also of what a human being is, because we bear the image of God. There's something connected to that. We also know, come the advent of Christ, that God takes on human flesh. He has a human nature. He becomes not like a human, he becomes a human. Born of a virgin, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, buried, risen on the third day, ascends to glory. All these things are physical beings, historical events that happen to a man, and we're told that he is God. So the image of God that we're told relates to being in Exodus is now related to a particular human being who we also say is God. The man God, Jesus Christ. And the early church talks about the divine human nature of Christ in a very different way than the gods are dealt with in, let's say, the Aeneid. The gods will appear there, but they're not human beings. They're not to be misunderstood as human beings. They can appear that way, but they aren't that way. Whereas Christ is presented as being a real man, living a real human life, and dying a real human death. And the bodily resurrection is a central plank of the Christian faith. It's not just that in the minds of the apostles he rose. No, he rose as a physical being, and the grave that he left behind was emptied of his body. Key features. When it comes to human nature, though, we still have the question from our vantage point of who we are. Everyone asks this question because our culture has taught us that this is the fundamental question, is who are you? And this is a question you can't answer, by the way. You can't answer the question, and the reason why you can't answer the question is that you're not the creator of yourself. And only the creator can answer the question of who you are. You don't make yourself. You can't fashion yourself. Jordan Peterson has self-authoring software right now where you can author yourself. I take that as a figure of speech. You have no capacity to author your own nature. It's not possible. That's the prerogative of the one who makes you. He will determine who you are. So if you want to know the answer of who you are, you have to ask, first of all, what's the nature of God and how does he relate to me? That's how you get towards that answer. Augustine asked the question, actually, in his Confessions, which I'm not going to read. That very question, who am I? He asks God. And he doesn't get an answer. But he does answer with the perspective of a believer. You made me, Lord, and you know who I am. And he says that our lives are restless until they find their rest in God. So this idea of finding your own identity, discovering it through trial and error, acting like an orphan in the world, is a futile effort. It leads to contradiction. Because if I think of, I am what I do, well, yesterday I did a really good thing, but today I did a really bad thing. Which of them is true of me? Well, I'm probably going to say the good thing and the bad thing. Well, I'm not, I was acting out of character. Well, was I? How do I determine which one's in character and which one's out of character? I happen to like the one where I look good. Okay. Jesus calls that hypocrisy. He says, I got a log in my eye, and I get to take it out. And I see a speck in my neighbor's eye, and yet I call that a log. So I have a distorted perspective on even other people's identity. And particularly, though, on my own identity, because my heart is corrupted. That's where Jesus says all corruption begins in the human heart. That's where the lies come from. That's where the evil comes from. It comes from within because of original sin. But by looking to Christ and seeing his identity in relation to me, it says in Colossians 3, I think, our life is hidden with Christ in God. If you want to know who you are, look to Christ, and your life, you, is hidden with Christ in God. And when he appears, you will appear in your glory. That's how you will know who you are. So it's a relational identity is what I'm saying. There's a relational aspect to it. I wanted to connect those otherwise sort of disconnected thoughts, just connect them in a Christian context, because I'm here to exposit literature and not to teach theology, but I need to make that connection here. Any comments or questions? I know there's a lot of questions about this, but I want to move on with this. I'll just leave it with that. Okay, so I'll stop that.